The salt-laced wind whipped through the bustling port town of Haeju, carrying the cries of gulls and the scent of fish. It was a town built on trade, secrets, and the delicate dance between wealth and poverty. Kim Seon-dao, disguised as a wealthy merchant, his fine silk robes hiding the sharp mind of a royal inspector, an Ankatsa, stepped off the ferry, his eyes already scanning the crowd. He'd come to Haeju seeking answers, drawn by whispers of corruption and unexplained deaths that clung to the town like the sea mist. The strict class distinctions, harsh laws, and feudal customs created a breeding ground for injustice, and Seon-dao was determined to unearth the truth. He wasn't just a scholar or administrator, he also possessed a sharp, cunning wit and a playful, almost roguish, demeanor, a stark contrast to the stern faces of most officials. He made his way to the most renowned Jisseing house in Haeju, the Jade Pavilion, a place whispered to be at the heart of the town's hidden currents. The building was opulent, with intricately carved wooden screens, delicate silk lanterns, and a constant murmur of music and laughter. He knew that within these walls, secrets flowed as freely as wine. He sought an audience with Seo Warayan, the head Jisseing, a woman famed for her beauty, grace, and sharp intellect. Her name, Lotus Blossom, was fitting, a symbol of beauty blooming even in murky waters. The Jisseing who greeted him, Mei Chun, her eyes sharp and assessing despite her painted smile, led him through a maze of corridors. Her name, ironically meaning, selling spring, hinted at the transactional nature of beauty and pleasure in this world. Mei Chun, while seemingly loyal to the house's mistress, possessed a subtle air of unease, a hint of sympathy that flickered in her eyes when Warayan's name was mentioned. Finally, he was ushered into a private chamber, where Warayan awaited. She was even more captivating in person. Her beauty was undeniable, a delicate porcelain face framed by raven hair. Yet a profound sadness lingered in her eyes. Her silk hanbok, though exquisite, couldn't mask the weariness that clung to her. She was a bird trapped in a gilded cage, her songs masking a deep sorrow. "Welcome, esteemed merchant," Warayan said, her voice like the chime of tiny bells, yet laced with a hint of melancholy. "What brings you to the Jade Pavilion?" "I seek pleasure, of course," Seon-dao replied, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "But I also seek stories. They say the Jade Pavilion holds the secrets of Haeju." Warayan's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Secrets can be dangerous, merchant. Some are best left undisturbed." "And some," Seon-dao countered, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "are too important to remain buried." He noticed a flicker of fear, then understanding, in her eyes. He knew he'd found a potential ally. The conversation flowed smoothly, filled with double meanings and subtle probes. Warayan's initial reserve began to melt, replaced by a cautious trust. He spoke of justice, of the plight of the common people, carefully gauging her reactions. Later that evening, as the moon cast its silvery glow upon the courtyard, Seon-dao found himself drawn to the haunting melody of a Gaegeum. He followed the sound, finding Warayan seated beneath a blossoming cherry tree, her fingers dancing across the strings. The music was filled with a deep, aching sorrow, a lament that spoke of lost love and broken dreams. "A beautiful, yet mournful tune," Seon-dao remarked, sitting beside her. Warayan sighed, her fingers stilling on the strings. "It is the song of my heart, merchant. A song of what was. And what can never be." She then revealed, in fragmented whispers and tear-filled pauses, the story of her past. A fisherman, her true love, stolen from her by the cruel machinations of a powerful woman, Zhou Gwin. He learned that Zhou Gwin, the concubine of a high-ranking official, held Haeju in her iron grip. She controlled the pearl trade, the salt mines, and even the human trafficking that flowed through the port. Her greed and ambition were boundless, and she used her influence to crush anyone who stood in her way. The previous officials who had dared to investigate her had met with untimely, accidental deaths. Assassins, rumors whispered, employed by the very woman they sought to expose. Xiandal's instincts, honed by years of uncovering corruption, told him that Warion's story held the key to unlocking the truth about Haeju. He also found himself drawn to her, not just as a source of information, but as a woman. Her strength, her resilience, her quiet defiance in the face of overwhelming adversity, it sparked a fire within him. A desire not just for justice, but for her. He knew, however, that he had to tread carefully. Zhou Gwin was a formidable enemy, and one wrong move could cost them both their lives. The next day, Xiandao, still under the guise of a carefree merchant, began to explore Haeju more thoroughly. He visited the bustling marketplace, where vendors hawked their wares, and the docks, where fishing boats bobbed alongside larger merchant vessels. He observed the stark contrast between the opulence of Zhou Gwin's residence, a sprawling estate overlooking the town, and the squalor of the fishermen's shacks. He listened to the grumbling of the common folk, their whispers of fear and resentment directed towards the concubine. He also sought out Park Mujin, a legendary swordsman rumored to reside in a secluded temple on the outskirts of town. Their connection was complex, a mix of past friendship and a lingering shadow of a shared, painful history. Xiandao needed Mujin's skills. His knowledge of the underworld, and his unwavering sense of justice, even if that justice sometimes walked a blurred line. Finding Mujin was no easy task. The temple was ancient, shrouded in mist and silence, a place where the echoes of prayers mingled with the rustling of leaves. Mujin, when Xiandao finally found him, was a figure of quiet intensity. His eyes, though weathered, held a spark of the legendary swordsman he once was. His hanbok was plain, almost monastic, but the worn hilt of his sword hinted at a life far from peaceful. Xiandao, Mujin greeted, his voice a low rumble. "What brings you to this forgotten corner of the world?" "Justice, old friend," Xiandao replied, "and perhaps a chance to settle old scores." He explained his mission, the corruption in Haeju, the deaths of the previous officials, and the iron grip of Zhou Gwin. He didn't shy away from mentioning Warion's plight, knowing that Mujin had a soft spot for the downtrodden. Mujin listened intently, his gaze unwavering. "Zhou Gwin," he murmured, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "Her name is whispered even in the darkest corners of the underworld. She is a viper, Xiandao. Be careful." "I intend to be," Xiandao said, "but I need your help. Your skills, your knowledge, and your sword." Mujin hesitated. He had withdrawn from the world, seeking peace in solitude. But the fire of justice, once ignited, was hard to extinguish. He nodded slowly. "For you, old friend, and for the innocent who suffer, I will draw my sword once more." Their alliance forged, Xiandao and Mujin began their investigation in earnest. They moved through the shadows, gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of Zhou Gwin's crimes. Xiandao, with his charm and wit, infiltrated the higher circles of Haeju society, attending lavish parties hosted by Zhou Gwin, feigning interest in her business dealings. He observed her closely, her arrogance, her cruelty, her insatiable hunger for power and wealth. He saw the way she treated her servants, the fear in the eyes of the merchants who paid her tribute, the desperation of the families whose daughters had disappeared into her service. Meanwhile, Mujin used his contacts in the underworld, gathering whispers from the docks, the taverns, and the back alleys. He learned of the smuggling routes, the payoffs, the enforcers who carried out Zhou Gwin's dirty work. He discovered that Zhou Gwin was not only involved in smuggling pearls and salt, but also in the trafficking of women and children, selling them to wealthy merchants and corrupt officials in other provinces, and even overseas. Xiandao, during one of his carefully orchestrated encounters with Zhou Gwin, managed to steal a glimpse of her ledger, a meticulously kept record of her illegal transactions. He saw the names of her accomplices, the amounts of money involved, the destinations of her human cargo. It was damning evidence, but he needed more. He needed proof that would stand up in court, proof that would bring down not only Zhou Gwin, but also her powerful protector in the capital. He also continued to see Warren, their meetings growing more frequent, more intimate. Their shared danger, their shared purpose, drew them closer. He saw the pain she carried, the scars of her past, but he also saw her strength, her unwavering spirit. Their conversations were no longer just about gathering information. They were about shared dreams, shared hopes, and a growing, undeniable attraction. The Jade Pavilion, with its veiled eroticism, became a backdrop for their budding romance, adding a layer of forbidden heat to their dangerous game. One night, under the cloak of darkness, Xiandao and Warren met in a secluded garden within the Jade Pavilion. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, the only light coming from the moon and the flickering lanterns. "I have found more evidence," Xiandao whispered, showing her a small, rolled-up parchment he had managed to copy from Zhou Gwin's ledger. "Names, dates, locations, it's all here." Warren's eyes widened. "This is dangerous, Xiandao. If she finds out." "She won't," Xiandao said, his voice firm. "I will protect you." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. Warren leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his. "I know you will," she whispered. "But I fear for you. Too. She is ruthless." He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. "Fear can be a powerful weapon, Warren. But it can also be overcome." Their kiss was tentative at first, then deepened, fueled by their shared danger, their shared passion, and a love that had blossomed in the shadows. It was a moment of raw, untamed emotion. A brief respite from the darkness that surrounded them. The sensuality of the moment was heightened by the knowledge of the risks they were taking, the forbidden nature of their connection. Their interlude was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Mei Chun, her face pale with alarm. "Warren. Zhou Gwin, she knows. She suspects you are aiding the merchant. Xiandao's blood ran cold. He knew this moment would come, but he hadn't anticipated it so soon. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." Warren nodded, her eyes filled with fear, but also with a newfound determination. She had made her choice. She would stand with Xiandao, no matter the cost. They fled the Jade Pavilion. Mei Chun guiding them through a secret passage that led to the back alleys of Haeju. But Zhou Gwin's men were already searching for them. The town, once a place of bustling commerce, had become a hunting ground. Xiandao, Warren, and Mei Chun, who had decided to throw her lot in with them, raced through the narrow streets. The pounding of their pursuers' footsteps echoing behind them. They sought refuge in a hidden storeroom beneath a fish market, the stench of brine and decay filling the air. "She'll find us here," Warren whispered, her voice trembling. "Not if we don't stay here," Xiandao said. He had a plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. He contacted Mujin through a prearranged signal, a specific pattern of knocks on a seemingly abandoned building. Mujin arrived swiftly, his sword drawn, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "They are close," he said. "We must make our stand." Xiandao nodded. "We will lure them to the docks," he said. "There. We will have the advantage." The docks, usually a scene of bustling activity, were eerily quiet under the cover of night. The only sounds were the lapping of waves against the wooden pilings and the creaking of the moored boats. It was a perfect setting for a final confrontation. As Zhou Gwin's men closed in, Xiandao, Mujin, and even Warren, armed with a small dagger she had concealed in her sleeve, prepared to fight. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the whispers of the wind and the distant cries of gulls. The climax was at hand. Zhou Gwin, her face contorted with rage, arrived with her entourage of guards. She stood on a raised platform overlooking the scene, her eyes blazing with fury. "You dare defy me," she shrieked, her voice echoing across the water. "You will all pay for this." Xiandao stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "It is you who will pay, Zhou Gwin. For your crimes, for your cruelty, for the lives you have destroyed." The battle was joined. Swords clashed, cries of pain and rage filled the air. Mujin, a whirlwind of steel, moved with a deadly grace, his sword a blur of motion. Xiandao, though not as skilled as Mujin, fought with a fierce determination, his every move fueled by his desire to protect Huarayan and bring Zhou Gwin to justice. Huarayan, despite her fear, fought bravely, using her small dagger to defend herself against any attacker who came too close. Mei Chun, surprisingly nimble and quick, used her knowledge of the docks to their advantage, leading attackers into traps and dead ends. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Xiandao, despite his skills, found himself outnumbered and outmatched. He took a blow to the shoulder, the pain searing through him. He stumbled, but Huarayan was there, stepping in front of him, her dagger raised defiantly. "Don't you dare touch him," she cried, her voice filled with a ferocity he hadn't seen before. Seeing Huarayan in danger ignited a new surge of strength within Xiandao. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain, and rejoined the fight. He fought with a renewed intensity, his every move precise and deadly. He saw an opening, a chance to strike at Zhou Gwin. He lunged forward, his sword aimed at her heart. But Zhou Gwin was not without her own defenses. She had anticipated his move. And one of her guards stepped in front of her, taking the blow meant for her. The guard fell, mortally wounded, but Zhou Gwin remained unharmed. "Fool," she spat at Xiandao. "You think you can defeat me?" Just when it seemed that Zhou Gwin would prevail, a new sound pierced the night, the pounding of hooves, the shouts of men. It was the townspeople, the fishermen, the merchants, the very people Zhou Gwin had oppressed for so long. They had been inspired by Xiandao's bravery, by Huarayan's defiance, and by Mujin's legendary reputation. They had armed themselves with whatever they could find, fishing nets, clubs, knives, even stones, and they had come to join the fight. The arrival of the townspeople turned the tide of the battle. Zhou Gwin's guards, outnumbered and demoralized, began to fall back. Zhou Gwin herself, seeing her power crumbling before her eyes, tried to flee, but Mujin intercepted her. Their duel was short but decisive. Mujin, his eyes filled with a cold fury, disarmed her with a swift, precise movement. Zhou Gwin, stripped of her weapon and her authority, knelt on the docks, defeated and humiliated. Xiandao, his body aching, his clothes torn and bloodied, approached her. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "It is over, Zhou Gwin," he said. "Your reign of terror is at an end." With the evidence gathered by Xiandao and Mujin, and the testimonies of Huarayan, Mei Chun, and the townspeople, Zhou Gwin was brought to justice. Her protector in the capital, exposed for his complicity, was also arrested and punished. The town of Haeju was finally free from her grasp. Xiandao, his mission accomplished, prepared to leave Haeju. He had brought justice to the town. But he had also found something unexpected, love. He stood on the docks, watching the sunrise paint the sky with vibrant colors. Huarayan stood beside him, her hand in his. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Huarayan looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "My place is here," she said. "I must help rebuild this town, help those who have suffered." Xiandao understood. He knew that her heart was tied to Haeju, to the people she had fought so hard to protect. He respected her decision, even though it pained him to leave her. "Then I will return," he said, his voice firm. I will return for you. He leaned down and kissed her. A long, lingering kiss that spoke of promises and farewells. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving Haeju behind, but carrying with him the memory of Warayan, the lotus blossom who had bloomed in the darkness. The ending was left open, a suggestion of a future reunion, a hope that their paths would cross again. The aftermath of Zhou Gwin's downfall rippled through Haeju like the tide, washing away the residue of fear and oppression. The town, once choked by her greed, began to breathe again. The fishermen returned to their nets with renewed vigor, the merchants traded freely, and the laughter of children echoed through the streets, no longer muffled by the fear of abduction. Xian Dao, before departing, ensured that the corrupt officials who had aided Zhou Gwin were also brought to justice. He used his authority as an Nkatsa to appoint a temporary administrator, a man known for his integrity and fairness, to oversee the town until a new, permanent official could be appointed. He also left behind a detailed report, outlining the extent of Zhou Gwin's crimes and the steps needed to ensure that such corruption would never take root again. He knew there was a long road to full recovery. Warayan, true to her word, dedicated herself to rebuilding Haeju. She used her influence and her considerable skills to help the women and children who had been victimized by Zhou Gwin. She established a shelter, a safe haven where they could receive care, support, and the opportunity to start anew. She also worked to revive the cultural life of Haeju, using her talents as a Jising to bring beauty and joy back to the town. The Jade Pavilion, once a symbol of Zhou Gwin's decadence and control, was transformed into a center for art and community, a place where the spirit of Haeju could be reborn. Mei Chun, freed from her forced servitude, became Warayan's most trusted ally. She used her knowledge of the town's secrets and her surprisingly sharp business acumen to help Warayan manage the shelter and the revitalized Jade Pavilion. She found a sense of purpose and redemption in her work, shedding the bitterness of her past and embracing a future filled with hope. Park Mu-jin, his sense of justice satisfied, returned to his secluded temple. He had found a measure of peace in helping Xian Dao, a reminder of the man he once was and the ideals he still held dear. He knew that the world would always need protectors, and he would be ready to answer the call whenever it came. But for now, he sought solace in the quiet solitude of the mountains, the rustling leaves and the chanting of monks, a balm for his weary soul. Xian Dao, back in the capital, continued his work as an Nkatsa, his reputation enhanced by his success in Haeju. He became known as a champion of the common people, a fearless crusader against corruption. But his heart remained in Haeju, with Warayan. He often found himself gazing at the moon, remembering their stolen moments under the night sky, their shared dreams, and the promise he had made. He knew that his duty to the king and the country came first, but he also knew that he could not forget Warayan. He began to make inquiries, subtly at first, about the possibility of being reassigned to a post closer to Haeju. He used his influence carefully, not wanting to draw undue attention to himself or to Warayan. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, but Xian Dao was patient. He knew that true love was worth waiting for, and he had faith that fate would bring them together again. He continued his work, fighting for justice, exposing corruption, and protecting the innocent, always with the image of Warayan in his mind, a beacon of hope guiding him through the darkness. He would use the time to ensure the proper channels would allow for him to be closer, and eventually claim his place beside the woman who held his heart. The open ending allowed for such a reality, and his actions reflected that desire.